let's stay on the Middle East for a moment, because about 8 years ago, I think, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he was, I think, at a future investment conference which Saudi Arabia had put on. And I think he's repeated these comments a bit recently as well, though I couldn't find sources for them. But he was on stage saying that, where is the quote? We want to destroy Islamic extremism and coexist with other religions. And then he goes on to talk about how there ought to be moderation and tolerance. So my question to you is there somewhat of the beginnings of perhaps an Islamic Reformation here, or are words like this to the effect that those saying them are that they're self-serving in some way, they're wanting to seem more moderate and tolerant than they are? Or do you think that they've reached the point within their own imperial ambitions, and I say imperial insofar as United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi, very influential, very moneyed, they sponsor an awful lot of events all over the world, they own lots of property, they in many respects have an Arabian empire, as it were, and there is these historical cycles that say when empires get to a certain level and they become multi-ethnic in some way, they start to liberalize. And we've seen that with Western empires and all the rest of it. Do you think this is something that is genuinely occurring, that we might be seeing the beginning of an Islamic Reformation, a softening of some of those more conquering rhetoric and scriptural reference you've talked about, or is it something else?
Is that in the Middle Eastern context you were asking?
Yeah. Well, yes, in the Middle Eastern context, but I suppose they're also highly influential in Europe too. So I guess you've got Erdogan is always whipping up Turks in Germany with whatever it is that he's focused on. But there's also lots of examples of Saudi or Qatar funding various institutions, centres, all the rest of it here. But if we're seeing some of the rhetoric changing amongst some of the most influential leaders, is that rhetoric to be believed? Is it something that suggests that there could be moderation and tolerance, or is it something else?
Yeah, so it's quite a long-winded question, but I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability, because there's quite
guilty
elements. No, that's fine. I'm just trying to give you a succinct answer, but I'm going to be jumping a bit as well, because obviously I think some of these GCCs, the Gulf Cooperation countries, are still very much, but I'm looking at Qatar here when I think of funding channels, especially, and Saudi Arabia back a few decades ago, and how they've already kind of done so much damage when it comes to British institutions, namely universities, and things like that, with the amount of money that they've kind of channeled into these. And we see the rise of Islamic societies, and, who have a lot more of a kind of extremist element to them, in terms of their societies aren't just like any other, cookery society or reggae society at university. It comes with a huge dose of dawah, which is essentially propaganda for Islam that's seeped into it. So that's kind of always operating in the background. But then I would say that, in my humble opinion, I do think when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia, which has been so heavily governed in a Wahhabi kind of context, with the ruling class, which will always be ulema, which is the religious kind of authority, which take precedence even over the monarchy, for example. I think it's been ruled like that for so long, and they've realized how in this modern day and age that, that stifles a lot of progress and a lot of money to be made. And if you look at countries like the UAE, they have put their economy and things like that to the forefront, as opposed to exporting Islam per se in that same way. So I do think Mohammed bin Salman to some degree does want reformation, because he is quite a young king himself. And, he knows that Saudi Arabia would need to take some of, take a leaf out of Dubai's book, or the UAE's book in general, if it wants to be a key player in the global economy And if it wants, tourism and things like that, which it will need to rely on because their oil is not going to last forever. So I mean, some people have even gone as far as to say, and I don't know if I buy this, but they've gone as far as to say maybe deep down he is not a Muslim himself, like as in he's kind of turned his back on the faith, but that would never be an outward confession that he'd be able to make. But I think he has taken up this fight against the existing status quo, where it's the ulema who make all the decisions and govern the country. And he wants to push back on that because he has said some very radical things to the effect of, literally 80% of the Hadith collection, which in Sunni Islam is very much like sacrosanct to part of your beliefs because it's like essentially Muhammad's life. He said that is not reliable and it's not something we should follow. And about, 20% of that is probably accurate. And then we've got the Quran. And saying something even as radical as that a few years ago would have definitely had the heads roll. But he has said it, and the kingdom is still moving in the direction. I think they've had some concerts now. They're constantly hosting snooker championships and all sorts. And, there's little tweaks there, like, do we allow alcohol? Do we not? And they haven't gone that far yet. But I do think him as a leader, he definitely wants change. And there is a general, growing up in the Middle East, I have seen like there is a stark difference when it comes to Arabs who, like Muslim Arabs in, let's say, for example, the GCC countries versus Muslims in South Asia, and then the British Muslims that we see in this country. The Arab Muslims in the GCC, they tend to be a lot more relaxed when it comes to their religion. I'm talking about your not nominal everyday person. Because obviously they live within an Islamic state in general, and there's kind of enough of Islam governing their lives, and they really, really care about economics a lot more. And I think you've got this, again, this is also a problem with Islam because it puts Arabic and it puts Arabia on such a pedestal that if you don't speak Arabic, first of all, you're not even classed as, truly understanding the religion. That's always up for question. And, you don't really belong to the lands that it originated from, and then it's kind of been imposed on your culture. So what I tend to see is that Pakistani Muslims, like my ethnicity, Bangladeshi Muslims, Muslims from Malaysian Muslims from all other countries tend that much harder to try and support Islam or kind of, show that they're Muslim. And in the UK, for example, that has really translated into riling up previous generations of British Muslims who actually hold their Muslim identity as their identity first and foremost before being British. And that's kind of the fight that they've chosen to fight, whether it's in whatever's happening geopolitically at the time. We need to take a stand, and we take a stand for Islam before we would ever take a stand for this country. And I go as far as to say they almost have a point to prove that they are out to go against the West and show the West why they're so bad and why they're so wrong. And you see this with casual British Muslim scholars who go on platforms and say, yes, we are at war with the West, or we do absolutely hate Christians and Jews because that's what our book says, and we will continue to do so. And you've got figures like Majid Nawaz who come out and act as if he's all reformed and he understands the extremist mind, but questions can be raised as to, has that really taken hold, or is he still kind of got the exact, battle that he's fighting? But it's the whole concept of taqiyya in Islam as well, that you can pretty much do anything to push forward Islam's goals, regardless of what you have to say to get there. So I do think the way Islam kind of manifests itself amongst non-Arab Muslims in a Western context is very different from how Islam manifests itself with Arabs within Arab countries.